Hallelujah, our God reigns. Hallelujah, our God reigns. Forever all my days. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, our God reigns. Hallelujah, our God reigns. Hallelujah, our God reigns. Forever all my days. Hallelujah. I will love you, Lord, my rock. I will love you, Lord, my shield. I will love you, Lord, my rock. Forever all my days, I will love you, God. I will love you, Lord, my rock. I love you, Lord, my shield. I will love you, Lord, my rock. Forever all my days, I will love you, God. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful day. It is Tuesday. It is Teachable Tuesday. Yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day. We won't call it the other day, but I want to say to my Indigenous family, thank God for you, and I hope that you all are finding ways to deal with continued traumatization of yourselves in your homeland. hmm Yeah. Sometimes people don't think to ask the natives how they're feeling and how they're doing. But that's something that's always on my mind. So, today, again, is Teachable Tuesday. In many states, I can't remember them all, but I do know Arkansas, I believe Kentucky, Florida, Georgia, and a host of others. You can just type it in today and find out what states this is the last day for you to register to vote so that you'll be eligible to vote in the November midterms. All right. So please go and look at that. I know I named a few, but there are a couple of more states that this is your last day to be able to register. One thing that is being found out, and I have several friends of mine who have checked, people are being purged from their voter roll. Now, I have been a voter since 1996, and I have voted in almost every election, I believe. Or if I didn't vote in person, I did an absentee ballot. So people are having to go and check to make sure that they're actually still registered to vote because the dirty tricks are already starting. And so some of these Republican administrators are purging black people, particularly black women specifically, from voter rolls in their states because they know that if you vote in November, you're going to vote them out pretty much. So this is why it's important to make sure that you go to vote.org. If you are already a registered voter, go to your state check on your voter registration with your state, as well as vote.org, which shows you all over the country, but make sure you check with your state as well because some people are finding that their name is still on the national roll, but it's been taken off of their state voters roll. All right. So again, if you catch it today, and find out that you're not registered to vote, you can actually re-register to vote as a new voter, and you'll be able to vote in November. If you don't catch it today, your vote is not going to count in November. That's how important it is. All right. So don't just take my word for it. Make sure you go and check for yourself that you are actually still registered with your state as a registered legitimate voter. There's nothing like getting to November and going to your polling station and finding out that your name has been purged from the voters roll. All right. But this is happening because people are cheaters. No other way to say it. All right. So that's what I wanted to say first. I want to say good morning to each of you who are on joining me today. Good morning, Lady Barbara. Good morning, Minister Franklin. Good morning, Lady Judy. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful day. Thank you all for sharing the broadcast. If you're not a share me, go ahead and share me. So today we are back in Stamp from the Beginning, but we're going to start in a Black History Reader with Dr. Claude Anderson, and we're going to look at 3 questions in his book today. Question number 39. Did the slave codes of 1705 intentionally inflict psychological damage on black people? A lot of times I see my fellow black brothers and sisters pounding really hard on the ills of the black community without taking a look at the psychological damage that has been done to the black community by this country. So don't just talk about one without understanding the other. Okay? America is responsible for the psychological damage that has been done and is being done to black people in this country. And that's not a debatable item with me. The problem is America has done very little to correct the psychological and physical and mental and emotional damage that it has done on African Americans. Yes, co-occurring psychological damages. And they're continuing to compound them, which is why when you see a nation that is unrepentant about its sins, God has to come in and respond. So that's why I am praying that God flip America, because America is not flipping on her own. She is too prideful right now and thinks that she is going to get away with the things that has happened to the people who reside in this country. It's not a matter of if the Lord is going to judge us. It's only really right now a matter of when, because our country and its leaders are continuously unrepentant while saying that they're doing things in his name. And if you really want to know, good morning, love. If you really want to know what offends God, go around doing things and doing harm to people in his name. That's offensive to God. Question number 42 we're going to look at today is there a voting guide for the average black American voter? And Dr. Claude Anderson lays out some different things that he wants us to take a look at in terms of political principles. All right. So if someone is having a hard time trying to get on to my Periscope, I hope that you will be able to go on to YouTube. All right. I do have the YouTube live stream going as well. So Powernomics, we'll look at political principles. And then the third question we're going to look at now is, the third question that he has for us has to do with policing. All right. And the question is, why is the pattern of black men killed by white law enforcement personnel so acceptable and so entrenched in society? So these are the 3 questions we're going to look at from Dr. Claude Anderson before we go into Stamp from the Beginning. I've been talking about the history of racial ideas. So let's look at the slave codes. The slave codes were laws that severely restricted slave behavior and were intended to prevent slave uprisings and rebellions. The slave codes imposed harsh physical punishment on the slaves. The black man was a particular target. Black men, all right, There's been a lot of debate about who is the war against. Um, is there a war on women? Is there a war on men? Is there a war on black men? Is there a war on black women? The reality is there is a war on, first of all, there's a overall war on humanity. Okay, there are people who dislike humanity in general and would just love to get rid of, as they said, I think 98% of the population. They would just love to just wipe out 98% of the population, and it would be the upper 2% wealthy living on the planet with animals. That's one vision of the world by certain people. All right. Then there is an attack on women and their rights, all right, to be independent, their rights to be heard, their rights to be protected against assault. And then there is an attack on men in terms of what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a protector? What does it mean to have care and responsibility for a family? So, how do I answer that question? Everybody's being tacked on different fronts and different levels. All right. Which is why many of us need to understand the overarching issue is really an attack on humanity. And so, if I could get you arguing with each other, fighting each other, hating each other, you'll never get to what the real overarching issue is, and that is the fact that there are a group of people who don't want humanity to exist, period. But if they can get you fighting each other and killing off each other, then that works to their benefit and their advantage. All right? Some of us haven't figured that out. It's an actual war against humanity. Some people, good morning, Lady Alana. Some people want to have robots ruling the world. And then the wealthiest elite people still alive, while 98% of the population that doesn't fit those qualifications is killed off, and they have the world to themselves, and they have technology to themselves, and they have animals to themselves that they preserved. Some people actually have that vision of a quote unquote perfect world. To them, a perfect world is all the poor people gone, all the sick people gone, all the people who don't have money gone, and they're running the world. All right. So we need to understand that. So during the Black Codes, the black man was a particular target. Black men were the natural guardians of the family, but the success of slavery depended on the ability of slaveholders to crush and control the black man. Slavery was successful. Slaveholders developed, yes, it is population control, yes. Slaveholders developed effective techniques to control the behavior of a male slave, techniques that would cripple his children and their children for generations to come. The slave codes formalized many control techniques, but left much room for creativity. The black man was totally helpless before his white master, who used the psychology of harsh physical punishment to encourage the black man to submit to slavery, to break his independent will, and to shape the attitudes of the black boys coming behind him in the slave pipeline. So, how do you shape the attitudes? You bring the strongest black man out there. This is what they did during slave times. There are historical records on this. You bring the strongest black man out. You punish him in front of the community, in front of his wife, in front of his children. You rape him in front of the community. Because if the strongest of you can be made subject, then everyone else behind you will fall in line. The slave owners did this by demeaning the man in front of his family so that it was clear that the black man could not protect them, that he was totally helpless before the white man, and that he could never be anything other than a slave. Now, let's fast forward to 2018 and let's talk about how black men in our society are viewed. And I'm not talking about the few that have money I'm not talking about the few that's maybe an athlete or an entertainer, and even some of them are viewed very negatively. I'm talking about your average black male. How are they viewed in society? Are people still saying the same thing? That it's clear that the black man cannot protect you. Many of them don't have jobs, and they're totally helpless before the white male. Has the conversation changed? So when people ask me, are we really free? I'm going to ask them again, has that conversation changed? Or do we now have black women parroting this conversation because they have been programmed to that conversation? Mm-hmm. All right. And then black women, we need to ask ourselves, if we're the ones getting all the money, all the jobs, all the loans, being able to get into colleges, we're the most quote unquote highly educated. We need to ask ourselves, why is that? And then why aren't we advocating for our counterpart to receive as well? Yes, it's to spite the black male. Yes. And if black women are not careful, we will fall into what is being done to pit us against each other. And unfortunately, a lot of black women have actually fallen into that. So there's that. All right. So you have to understand that there is a system being redesigned. Yes. The system is being redesigned to keep you cursing your counterpart rather than trying to work with your counterpart and see how you can make it together. Because here's what I do know: I don't see white women going around talking about Billy Bob and how Billy Bob always drinking his beers and how Billy Bob can't get no job. Even though Billy Bob is sometimes in the same predicament as the black male, I don't see Sue talking down about Billy Bob. Why? Because she understands that Billy Bob is her counterpart, whether she like it or not, and whether Billy Bob is doing well at the moment. I'm just saying, I want us to think. So, if a scenario is being created to get me to come against my male counterpart, when when my DNA and when science, even if you don't believe in God, when science tells you, all right, that all other families come out of the black family, the black male and the black female produce all other families. Without us, everybody else stops coming along because ours is, all right, ours is the original DNA. So the reality is, as one researcher said who has been researching and studying black families for over 40 years now, white male, he said, without the black family, there is no humanity. There is nobody else. Because we are the origin and we are the core. Now, if they know this, I don't understand why we don't know this and why we don't understand this and why we don't comprehend this and the importance of that. Let me keep reading. It has long been the role of males in most cultures to provide for and protect the family and to provide leadership and training to the children. Maybe that's why we help raise everybody. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a whole other sermon. We are the parent DNA of the world. Somebody's going to get that. It has long been the role of males to provide for and protect the family and to provide leadership and training to the children. Let me say that again, because for some reason people think it's the female's job to provide leadership and training to the children. Even if you don't read scripture, but we do over here, it was the man's responsibility to train and teach the children. Go read Deuteronomy. If you disagree, go read it and see who God is talking to about teaching the children. Hmm. When African men were brought to these shores, slavery interfered with and perverted their normal masculine behavior patterns. Commercial enslavement was primarily a gender specific industry. The slaveholder feared the black man more than he feared the black woman. That's still true in 2018. That's why a black woman will probably continue to get the jobs and the loans and the college admissions before the black male will. Until the early 1800s, nearly 80% of the slaves brought into this country were black men. They were bringing the men first. In the 1600s, in the Virginia colony, both white women and black women were outnumbered by their male counterparts 4-1. White slave owners wanted the strongest slaves that they could find, and they worked them to death before they were 40 years of age. African women became important as breeders when the Constitution outlawed importing slaves after 1808. So, this is where slavery becomes something in the United States that is very different from what was happening in other parts of the world. All right? When other parts of the world began to cut off their slave trade, they were done. That was it. But the United States wanted to keep on going. They wanted to keep the gravy train going. So they began a process of chattel slavery, or breeding people specifically like animals to be slaves into perpetuity. What does that mean? That means that I take a female slave and I've decided that whatever comes out of her body from now until forever belongs to me forever in the slave trade. So that means her children, her children's children, her children's 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 children into perpetuity. As many generations of human beings that I can pull out of this one woman as I breed her, that's how many slaves I'm going to increase my wealth with. It was true that black women having a higher birth rate, greater longevity, less harsh lifestyle, and being in the protected class with less chance of being killed allowed the number of black women to catch up to and surpass the number of black men. So, now that historically we know that the black women had this high birth rate, greater chance of living longer, now all of a sudden when you free black people, guess who becomes the target of making sure they don't have so many children? And the white supremacists have already figured this out. The white supremacists feel like, listen, America is browning and blackening because these people are popping out the babies. And they're popping them out at a rate that is going to cause us to lose hold of power by numbers in this country. So they are encouraging the white female to have more children, have as many children as you can, start as early as you can, get married at 17, 18, 19. How do I know? Because I have friends, white friends, that believe this. That's how I know. And I listen to them talk. All right? So have as many babies as you can. Start 17, 18, 19, get married right out of high school. You can still go to college in many cases, but they want them to get married and start having babies as soon as possible. Because for them, it is about genetic annihilation and loss of majority people in this country. And that means that they will not be able to stay in political power, which means if you lose political power, you lose the ability to control the laws in the lawmaking, in the policies. All right? The slave codes had a psychological basis. The purpose was to create a population of slaves that were docile, compliant, and would never rise up against slaveholders. Slavery also had an effect on those who imposed the harsh treatment. They became dehumanized and conditioned to inflicting pain. Thus, the slave codes had psychological effects that lasted for generations on both the white people who imposed the treatment as well as recipient blacks. That conditioning is on display today in many ways. For instance, when white police officers use excessive violence and kill unarmed black men. When you have officers saying, I shot them and I don't know why I shot them. Their hands were up. The person says, don't shoot me. I don't have anything in my hands. And the officer still, it becomes an impulse. And they say, I don't know why I shot them. All right. We're still seeing the psychology many generations later. The slave codes crippled 15 generations of people. They kept black men from fulfilling the role of responsible father and husband. And now we want to come and we want to fuss out the black men for not fulfilling the role of father and husband, when for 15 generations, this is what you did to a people that you have yet to repent for. I'm still waiting. This degraded black people. It made them hopeless and non-productive for anything other than slave duties, and criminalized nearly every normal behavior that they engaged in. Because what happens when you criminalize normal behavior, what you're in essence saying is, I want to keep you as an animal. Because if you're doing normal human behavior and I criminalize it, what I'm basically saying is animals shouldn't be allowed to do that, because it's a human behavior and it's not an animal behavior. It is unconscionable for society to look at black people today, criticize their behavior, and ignore the permanent harm that whites, the slave codes, and similar laws intentionally inflicted on an entire race of people. While the slaveholding ancestors designed the system of slavery and applied the pain and degradation, white people today still enjoy the benefits of that system. When the psychological damage is added to the fact that blacks could not benefit from the resources found in the country, and they were in fact considered a resource, it is a wonder that any black people have managed to rise above the legacy of slavery. Blacks will need resources from the dominant society in order to, as the Constitution commands, rehabilitate and lift their race. The call for reparations should come from fair-minded people. It should not only come from black people. It should not only come from black people. It should not only come from black people. When you understand what this country has done, it should be more than African Americans calling for reparations. This is not rocket science. The United Nations has called on America already. It has said, because of the abuses of the generations of black people in this country, they need reparations. Do you think the United States is listening to the United Nations? Nope. And so, again, we won't listen to the counsel that's being given. So guess what? Guess who's going to have to flip our country because we don't listen? And there's a measure of pride and a measure of arrogance that says, who are you to tell us how we should treat the people that for generations we have put our foot on the necks of their forefathers? Who are you to tell us that we should take our foot off their necks? So if we don't listen to human counsel, then there's only one other counsel to appeal to, right? Let's talk about voting, since we are yesterday made 30 days out. We're 30 days out for voting. Also, we are sending up our prayers for Florida in terms of I think it's a hurricane or tropical storm, one of them, Michael, that is supposed to hit on Thursday. We are praying that everybody there is prepared. And if you are in a flood zone, go ahead and evacuate. Don't wait until the water is up to the windows in your house and you can't get out. Go ahead and evacuate if you know you live in a flood zone. I lived in Tallahassee. There are several flood zones there. Get out. All right. Most of Tallahassee is not prepared for, the structures in Tallahassee are not really prepared for a really bad storm. All right. Thank you, Franklin, for your comment. Yes, we want to go all over the world, healing the world, and we don't want to do Black America right. So let's look at question 42. Is there a voting guide for the average Black American voter? The writer says, I offer Black voters strategies they can use to maximize the effect of their group vote and gain the greatest group based tangible benefits. When Black people play American politics based on the needs and interests of other groups, they are not playing to win, they are just playing to play, to be accepted, to get along, and to get nothing in return for their efforts. The 1870 Code of Conduct was the Maryland law that codified the political behavior whites expected Black people to exhibit. It described the rules of how Blacks could play in the game of politics, but only play. Politics, however, is socioeconomic Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. The Powernomics Guide for Voters is a new code of conduct for Blacks based on the assumption that they will play to win for self and team. These principles require a group change in behavior and would demonstrate to all Blacks as a group that they will no longer abide by the 1870 Code of Conduct, that they are instituting a new code. To implement new strategies, Black voters should begin by cleaning their own house first. They must no longer tolerate Black elected officials or others who purport to represent Blacks but actually want to only play in the game of politics. These officials want to be seen in a positive light as generally friendly and cooperative, but do not want to deliver benefits to Black supporters, preferring instead to deliver benefits to competitor groups, which is, I believe, what happened in Alabama. Um, Black women came out in large numbers and overthrew the candidate Roy Moore and put in another guy. I think his name was Doug. I can't remember his last name. And as soon as he got in, he started ignoring the Black voters who put him in and started leaning his ideas more towards conservative Republicans. And this happens quite a bit. People get on board to support a candidate that says that they're going to, Doug Jones, that says that they're going to do something to help Black America. And then when they get in, oh, sorry, I already got your vote. I really don't have to speak to your needs. Well, the next election that comes around, they need to vote Doug Jones right on out and find someone who will meet the interests of the people. So it does happen, as Claude Anderson says. These action steps below are a guide to Black people for implementing new political strategies. These are steps for a new code of conduct in politics that Blacks should follow. These Powernomics principles in politics are narrowly focused to address the needs and interests of Black Americans and should be used as criteria to analyze candidates, political parties, and ballot issues. If you go to your local library, most of your local libraries may have something already, like a voter's guide. I know our local library does. They have a voter's guide of all the candidates that are running in November. And you can read through what they think on certain issues. And for the candidates that feel they're too good to answer any questions, and it says candidate has not answered any questions regarding these issues, those are the people I automatically put to the side, because people want to know what you believe about these issues. Healthcare. They want to know what you believe about the environment. They want to know what you believe about minority representation. All of these different issues across the board. And if you think that you're too good to answer the questions that people are going to be spending their time reading, then you're automatically off of my choice for a candidate, because you didn't even think enough of the constituents that you want to represent to answer the basic questions. So, number one, he says, play to win. Politics is a game that decides what groups receive the benefits. Black people should not participate in a game in which they can never win. Vote to win and to get group benefits within the group vote. Number two, negotiate quid pro quo agreements with candidates and parties like everybody else does. Create a list of tangible and measurable benefits your group expects to receive from candidates and parties in return for our group's votes. Vote only for those candidates who promise and deliver the most material benefits to Black Americans for their votes. Do not even consider supporting a candidate who, every time you ask them, what do you plan to do for the Black community, they resort to using terms like everyone, minority, diversity, and people of color, while they are specifically seeking to gain the Black vote. Because they're already telling you you're going to be lumped into a general cloud of people of color, which means that you possibly may never see things done for your own specific community. Number three, aggregate group resources, voting as a block. Voting is a team based activity in which the majority wins and rules. This is why many times politicians go out and they want to gain the endorsement of a police union or a teachers union or a specific vocational workers union. Why? Because if they gain that endorsement, they know that that union is going to vote as a block. So they will have those votes locked in. All right. He says, build an independent party that uses the Black bloc vote to extract group benefits from political candidates, regardless of the race of the candidate. Once elected, use your block vote to hold elected officials accountable. If no candidate promises group benefits, then withhold your Black bloc vote. If politicians win because of the Black vote but fail to deliver measurable benefits, discipline that politician by using the Black vote to recall them or defeat them in the next election. Number four, vote the economic interest of your group first. What Blacks own and control determines their rights and opportunities. Use your group vote to control economics to influence and control the politicians in your community. Prioritize and vote the economic interests of your group before looking out for everyone else. 5. Support only those who support Black Americans. Do not support any political party, political candidate, or business, regardless of color, which will not publicly support Black America. Demand explicit support. Under the new code of ethics in politics, it will no longer be acceptable to send Black politicians to office without them looking out for Black America. Candidates who get Black support must deliver. Inappropriate behavior or betrayal of the community will not be acceptable. This new code should also apply to corporations and ethnic businesses established in Black neighborhoods. Black people must require those businesses to marshal their political resources to begin to eradicate systemic problems in the community, such as housing, unemployment, lack of top quality schools, and poor food. It is no longer acceptable to build a business in the Black community and refuse to hire Black people to work in those businesses. It will no longer be politically acceptable for businesses to extract money out of the neighborhood without making a contribution to the well-being of the Black consumers. And number 6, reject intangible symbolic measures as payment for your votes. The 1870 Political Code of Conduct defined the behavior of Black elected officials and still guides that behavior today. The code conditioned the politicians, but it also conditioned the Black voters. It taught them not to vote for their own interests in politics. It conditioned white people to expect that Black voters would not speak or even name their own group or articulate the needs of the group. Black politicians and voters have not publicly rejected conservative behavior required by the old code of conduct. We need to disavow that code to speak and begin to vote in a way that benefits our group and hold accountable all those who benefit from Black political action. Blacks should use their vote to elect people who will take positive action for our specific group and to impose consequences on those who will not. What is he saying? He's saying if people cannot answer the question specifically, what do you plan to do for the Black community? And I'm going to just look at him just like this. What do you plan to do for the Black community? Don't tell me about what everybody. No. What do you plan to do for the black community? If you are running to hold a seat in a predominantly black community, what do you plan to do to assist this community? You need a plan. If you don't have a plan for the black community, we're not voting for you. It's that simple. How are you going to be saying that you represent a community and you go out and you petition and you stomp for everybody else's interests, but then when people go to your district, everything about the black community you say you represent has not improved? People need to be called out on that. All right. Question 49, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a little bit of stamp from the beginning today. Why is the pattern of black men killed by white law enforcement personnel acceptable and entrenched in our society? I'm going to show you a picture of two images. One is a slavery plantation police badge issued to protect whites and property. All right. And this is from the Lest We Forget Slavery Museum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then the other one is a Ku Klux Klan badge. And the source of this image is the U.S. Library of Congress. So let me show you the images first so you will see them. All right. So that was the badge of the slave plantation police. And that was the Ku Klux Klan badge that people in our society could wear. If you saw people wearing those, you knew that they had some sort of authority, in a bad way, to come and collect you. All right. For centuries, America has been a killing field for young black men, especially, unfortunately, by white law enforcement. Although a long historical pattern, incidents in recent years have been troubling. In nearly every instance, courts and grand juries allowed those who profile, beat, or kill young black men to go unpunished. Now, we know in 2018, we've actually started to see some traction with police officers actually being charged guilty and seeing their court cases go to trial, which really had not been happening before 2012, before Trayvon Martin. But because of all the activism and the advocacy that has been getting on people's nerves, because of all the agitation, something is finally being done. And in some cases, the police officer is found guilty, and in other cases, they are not. But we're actually starting to see improvement in this area. So why have these men been going unpunished? Because the underclass status of blacks, which caused them to have unique historical experiences, is codified in our nation's documents. The Constitution of the U.S., as we discussed before, and the Bill of Rights declare America is a land of exceptionalism, the cradle of democracy, and a nation that values immigrants. Blacks were exceptional too. They were the nation's only non-immigrants. They were valued only as human property, entitled to be treated just like field animals. This lack of respect for a black man's life, a black man's rights, and his contributions became infused into the nation's spirit and codified into legal and political infrastructure. America's perception of black men has been framed by the U.S. Supreme Court's infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision. All right? It was a Dred Scott decision where a black slave declared he was a free person because he had visited temporarily and lived in a free state. He took this to court, took it all the way to the highest court, the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, however, quote, a black man has no rights which a white man is bound to respect, mainly because property can't declare itself free. This infamous ruling never was reversed in over 150 years, and it has been locked into the culture and collective American psyche and passed down generation to generation of ethnic whites. The first lesson immigrants learn when they come to this country, and I know because I've talked to some of them, one of the first lessons they learn when they come to this country is that they are prized and valued over and above native black people. And some of them are counseled to stay away from black Americans. Exactly. This prevailing attitude impacts every aspect of how our political and law enforcement systems view and treat black people. This nation's public policies of benign neglect, which means to basically let black people and let black communities decay, don't care about them, and political correctness further depreciated the value and rights of black Americans. Those policies were constructed to kill off the black civil rights movement of the 60s and to make all forms of blackness invisible. The policy of benign neglect took the focus off of black people, and over the course of the next 50 years, it morphed into political correctness and diversity, or policies that do not distinguish or specifically help black people. The views of law enforcement and society in general carry these legacies of slavery, of Jim Crow, of peonage, and the Dred Scott decision. So when people say, and I actually saw somebody write this last night on a broadcast, and they said that that people from other countries have it harder than black Americans. Number one, people from other countries have a source country they can return to. If people from other countries come over to America and they're being mistreated by Americans, they have a consulate that they can call on to say, I'm being mistreated over in America. And that country will be able to respond and say, America, what are you doing to our citizens over here? Black Americans don't have that. Hello. We don't. Why? Because we are the only non-immigrant people in this country. All right? If a immigrant comes over here and they feel like they're being mistreated, they can pack up their bags and return back to their country. Where are we going? Tell me where we going. Where are we going? All right? So it's not as easy or cut and dry as people think. And this needs to be stated over and over and over again to my foreign African brothers and sisters who come over here and who say things like, I don't understand why black people can't get ahead. When you come over, you are given the advantage of being an immigrant because you are placed above black Americans. Black Americans have been fighting for equality since our ancestors were released from slavery. Black Americans, not immigrants, Black Americans have a 220-year wealth gap by which we are trying to close. And it doesn't help if you're not trying to help us close it. All right? So when you say, why can't we get ahead? I noticed that some of our African immigrant brothers who come over here, they're not told the history of America. They're not told the history of slavery and Jim Crow. And when they start learning about it, then they begin to understand, oh, well, yeah, if somebody has had their foot on my neck for almost 400 years, then yeah, I'm going to have a hard time catching up and getting ahead. All right. And if a system was built on my ancestors and my ancestors were the cash capital and credit, then yes, I'm going to have a hard time getting ahead. All right. So I encourage those of you who are coming over to pick up some actual history books, Black history books, and begin to read and study what has happened to Black Americans in this country before you go make criticism about, well, I came over here and I'm doing just fine. Well, you're doing just fine because when you came over, the laws automatically elevated you above the ancestors of the enslaved. That's why you're doing fine. And if they chose to, by law, recategorize you, you would see how fine you weren't doing very quickly. Let me finish this. All right. Having relinquished the few concrete gains made during the civil rights movement, blacks have slid back into a powerless underclass status. They should, however, not be treated as guests in America. This nation was founded on the blood, sweat, and labor of millions of black people who were denied their very humanity and the fruit of their labor. Because you do also must understand that if you're coming over as an immigrant, you too are coming over as a benefit of the blood, sweat, tears, and labor that you too are standing on. So I find it very interesting that people come over here and they believe that they can insult Black America without understanding that without Black America, there wouldn't be anything for you to be coming into called a country, because it was built on the blood, the sweat, and the labor of millions of Black people who were denied their own humanity and the fruits of that labor. The newly fabricated class groups, especially immigrants, inherited unearned benefits, respect, and rights to which Black people were entitled to but never received. The larger society adds further insult to injury when it participates in public dialogue that gives the false impression that all people and groups have contributed equally to the development of this nation. That is a convenient myth. Everyone has not contributed equally to the United States of America. Let's be clear on that. Lots of people are benefiting, but everybody has not contributed equally. The racial problems between law enforcement and Black men will not abate until this nation addresses the history and achievements of Black Americans. Police power is freely exercised against Black men who are perceived as obsolete and powerless to do little more than march and riot. The larger society has a responsibility to resolve the long-standing dehumanization of Blacks that is contained in our foundational documents and to erase the emanating legal precedents. The tension between law enforcement and Black people continues as long as whites own and control 98% of all the nation's wealth, income, businesses, land, privileges, and all levels of government. We see what happened this past weekend when all levels of government are controlled by white. Because the people said this man should not be confirmed to the Supreme Court. And even if you look at the number of people who voted for him and the number of people who voted against him, the number of people who voted against him was in a larger population of the whole American whole. But guess what? He's still been confirmed for the court. So again, we see what happens when only one group holds the majority of power in our country. It leaves most of us looking like, what is going on here? Why is not the will of the people being served? Well, if you understand white supremacy, in white supremacy, the will of white people is served before everyone else. All right? So this is where we are as a nation. Lastly, the maldistribution that slavery produced and the cultural effects of the Dred Scott decision must be considered in any serious efforts to analyze the relationship between Black people in law enforcement. Calls for healing, no matter how sincere, will not fully correct the problem. Understanding the historical context would be a better beginning point. At least both groups would understand the importance of reversing the holding of Dred Scott and the contribution of the United States Constitution to the problem. So, to be clear, the Dred Scott decision was never reversed. That precedent that was set, let me read the precedent again. A Black man has no rights which a white person, a white man, is bound to respect. That is still on the books. And because it's still on the books, you still have people in our country that act on that precedent. All right. We've got 5 minutes left. Let me see if I can at least start chapter 3 of the book, Stamped from the Beginning. For those of you who are looking for a excellent resource on tracing racial ideology from its beginning, all right? How does it get off the book? There's got to be some legal action taken to get it off. And there are people working on it, but it still has not come to fruition. So there are people that are actually working on it. If you're looking for a book that gives you a history of racial ideas, what people have thought century to century, and how those ideas carried over into America, this is the book you want to get. All right. We're on chapter 3, Coming to America. We just finished up talking about American priests, how the priests played a part in the racial ideology that began to spread, and then he began to feel bad about his part in spreading this racial ideology, but it was too late. It was too late. So that ideology about black people being beast-like, being animals, being a terror, all of those kinds of ideas began to spread. Explorers wrote about their adventures, and their tales fascinated Europeans. This new travel literature gave Europeans sitting by their firesides a window into faraway lands where different looking people resided in cultures that seemed exotic and strange. But the literary glimpses that explorers provided of African lands were usually overshadowed by the self interest of the backers of the expeditions, who aimed most of all to fulfill their colonizing and slave trading desires. Even a lonely abolitionist, French philosopher Jean Bodin found his thoughts bogged down by tales connecting two simultaneous discoveries, that of West Africans and that of the dark, tailless apes walking around like humans in West Africa. Africa's heat had produced hypersexual Africans, Bodin theorized in 1576. And, quote, intimate relations between the men and beasts still give birth to monsters in Africa. The climate theory of Africa's hot sun transforming people into uncivilized beasts of burden still held the court of racist opinion, but not much longer. For the English traveler writer George Best, climate theory fell apart when he saw on an Arctic voyage in 1577 that the Inuit people in northeastern Canada were actually darker than the people living in the hotter south of Africa. In a 1578 account of the expedition, Best shied away from the climate theory, explaining, quote, the Ethiopians' blackness. He found an alternative, quote, Holy Scripture, or the curse theory that had been recently articulated by a Dominican friar in Peru and a handful of French intellectuals, a theory that became enticing to slaveholders and still to this day to many racist Christians. In Best's whimsical interpretation of Genesis, Noah orders his white and angel like sons to abstain from sex with their wives on the ark, and then tells them that the first child born after the flood would inherit the earth. When the evil, tyrannical, and hypersexual Ham has sex on the ark, God wills that Ham's descendants shall be so black and loathsome, and Best telling that it might remain a spectacle of disobedience to all the world. So, if you thought the first lie told, if you thought the recent lie told about Ham, all right, that Ham is cursed, that's still going through Christian circles to this day, all right? If you thought that was bad, this was the original lie. The original lie was that Ham had sex on the ark and that his blackness was his curse as a result of having sex on the ark. And it was to show, his blackness was to show his disobedience to the whole world, that he had been disobedient to God. Now, I've heard a lot of foolishness, but that is some straight foolishness. The first major debate between racists had invaded the English discourse. This argument about the cause of inferior blackness, curse or climate, nature or nurture, would rage on for decades and eventually influence settlers to America. Curse theorists were the first known segregationists. Let me say that again. Curse theorists were the first known segregationists. So where does the idea of segregation comes from? It comes from the fact that we're supposed to keep away from this group of people because they are supposedly cursed by God. All right? That is the doctrine behind segregation. They believed that black people were naturally and permanently inferior and totally incapable of becoming white. Now, we are incapable of becoming white. Technology is trying to fix that, though, and bleaching creams is trying to fix that too. We are incapable of becoming white, but that doesn't mean that we're inferior. Climate theorists were the first known assimilationists, believing black people had been nurtured by the hot sun into a temporary inferiority, but were capable of becoming white if they moved to a cooler climate. So these were the ideas that were going around, all right, in the 1500s. George Best produced his curse theory in 1578 in the era between Henry VII and Oliver Cromwell, a time during which the English nation was experiencing the snowballing, conflicting passions of overseas adventure, domestic control, or to use historian Winthrop Jordan's words, the voyages of discovery overseas, the inward voyages of discovery, the mercantile expansion abroad, the progressively commercialized economy at home, the fabulous profits that they were seeing, the exciting adventure stories, and class warfare all destabilized their social order in Elizabethan England, a social order being intensely scrutinized by the rising congregation of morally strict, hyper-dictating, pious Puritans. George Best used Africans as social mirrors, to use Jordan's phrase, for the hypersexuality, greed, and lack of discipline. The devil's machinations that he found first in England but could not speak of. Normalizing negative behavior in faraway African people allowed writers to denormalize negative behavior in white people, to denormalize what they witnessed during intense appraisals of self and nation. So, in short, in order to get all of the attention off of the negative behavior that was happening in white people in Europe, they scapegoated black people. Why do I feel like I'm talking in 2018 to a problem that has started in the 1500s? In order to deflect from the negative behaviors of white people happening in their own country, they began to use Africans as the worst of the worst, and the beastly and the hypersexual, and all of these negative connotations began to be attached to black people, because if I can attach them to black people, then maybe I'm not so bad. And I don't have to look in the mirror at my own country and my own people and their own depravity. He could have just been right here in 2018. So we're going to stop there. I know that was an interesting place to stop. But yeah, we're just repeating history, people. Repeating history. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I have been your host today, Shantae Charles. I hope that I have said something today that would spark your interest, spark your research, spark your attention to go and do some more digging for yourself. All right? Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out and be light today. Let us as Black Americans especially, let us shake off the curses that people have tried to put upon us as a result of not wanting to deal with their own ethnic issues. God has not cursed us, God has blessed us. So now that we see where these doctrines of demons come from, we can begin to speak to them more specifically. And I hope that you will do so in your own life. Take care and God bless.